There's a war of genocide that the ignorance of Europe and Asia is allowing them, for the sake of trying not to be faced with genetic annihilation, has allowed them to concoct ways of murdering us. I mean, we can go to the syphilis experiments at Tuskegee, or we can go to the AIDS in Africa. I mean, look at this thing in Africa. We got AIDS, and so everybody in Africa, all of a sudden, some of the first we saw popped up in New York City in the homosexual community, now it pops up in Africa, and tens of millions of people have got it, and the pharmaceutical company is going crazy selling them drugs that they have to stay on for perpetuity. Billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars, you are guaranteed, because all these Africans have to take this medicine for the rest of their life. Give me a break. You tell me the guy who enslaved me, the guy who practiced colonialism against me, the guy who raped my mama, my sister, cut the testicles off my father, ripped me apart with horses, all of a sudden is gonna come to my well-being and make me a medicine that's good for me, when his whole history is about profit and genocide at any cost, even if it meant killing his mother. And I'm not just talking about our European brothers and sisters as regards dealing with the black brothers and sisters. If you just read books on the Inquisition and the horror and the genocide waged against European working people and the women of Europe is so horrific, it makes even the transatlantic slave trade looks pale sometimes.
The whole AIDS hoax has been about us getting to take the medication. There's no HIV that creates AIDS. They found that the HIV is a very innocuous, very benign so-called virus and doesn't cause anything. What does cause AIDS is drugs, the taking of medications. And what created the AIDS condition in the homosexual community that came what is known as GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency, were these poppers, amyl nitrate and butyl nitrate, these things that were used for the heart to dilate the muscles. Well, the homosexual community, the one who created it into these little popping things, when you broke the seal, it made a pop, so they call them poppers. It was the inhalation of these things that began to bring down the so-called immune system of the homosexuals, and they began to have this immunodeficiency based upon overuse of this. Why did they use these poppers? Because when they used these poppers and they inhaled it, not only did they get the rush, but the anus began to dilate and relax. So the homosexuals were using this left and right. Thousands are being sold here in New York. And when they found that, they did not put in that poppers were the ones, and that drugs and these poisonous medications were creating the conditions called AIDS. They took the opportunity to ride the HIV/AIDS connection because they knew the money that would be made and that they could recruit people into believing that a heinous disease had attacked everybody. And where did it come from? Africa.
It's always wise to study your enemy. If you're going to defeat someone, you must know their strengths and their weaknesses.
People have been utilizing Africans to heal themselves for centuries. And people have been going to African shamans, African witch doctors to find cures for themselves, that Eastern medicine. So people have been going to African people to cure themselves for years.
The doctor that's given credit for a lot of the internal examinations that women go through, those instruments were first tested on women who were enslaved. And I can only imagine, well, I can't even imagine. A woman could imagine. But the kind of pain that that woman was put through to test those particular iron, steel objects that would go up through their bodies.
In the United States, what they would do with slave children, and this has been well documented, to cure rheumatism and to cure gout and to cure arthritis, they would place their feet on top of a slave child and just keep their feet there for hours, thinking that the child, the melanin, would draw out whatever sickness the slave masters would have.
Well, we know that a lot of things have happened in our hospitals. We know that experiments was used on our people in almost every city hospital in America.
Henrietta Lacks was a sister who lived in Baltimore, and who had cervical cancer, and ultimately died of cervical cancer. And the doctors harvested some of her cells, and what they discovered in performing tests on her cells were that her cells were immune to specific diseases, specific cancers. So there was a quality in her cells that was resistant to disease. And they began to develop a host of vaccines and treatment modalities using the cells of this black woman, and they never told her family that they had harvested her cells, that they had made millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars.
Henrietta Lacks' own DNA and her cells are all over the world right now because they were so prolific, they just kept on multiplying. That was an indication of the fact that as African peoples, we hold the genetics for eternal youth.
There's a book called Acres of Skin that talks about the experiments that was done on black men in Philadelphia prisons from the 1950s to the 1970s.
In addition to the many medical experiments that are done on blacks in hospitals and prisons around the country, many people believe that chemtrails that are often seen over black communities purposely contain chemicals that create adverse reactions within the black community.
The chemtrails are dangerous because of what they contain: barium, strontium, and genetically altered red blood cells. What are genetically altered red blood cells doing in an aerosol?
And if you go to Harvard, they have a place on the campus, one of the tallest buildings on Harvard University. It's called the Herbarium. The Herbarium. In there, every floor is dedicated to some parts of Africa and Asia, and mostly Africa, where the young scholars who are working on their PhD is sent to study the fauna and the herbs and the plants of these places, and to interview the so-called healers and witch doctors, and come back to Harvard and tell what medicine, what medicinal purposes these herbs, fauna, and plants are used for, and then they create synthetic versions of it and sell that formula to the pharmaceutical companies.
And we were going to use rabbits. Can you imagine that? All we were trying to do is create an antidote.
For what?
Say that again. I want to hear your voice.
For what?
Well, we had this plan. A plan that we're ready to put back online today. I'll show you. Karad, show them.
Yada.
Do you know my building, Sachs Tower? Got that great big spire up on top? That spire is filled with tons of chemical toxins. Bad stuff. That kind of bad. In a few hours, Shredder is going to unleash all that stuff over the whole city. The initial death toll will shake world governments to their core. In 30 days, the city of New York will be a quarantine zone. And that is where my company comes in. I'm gonna save everyone with the antidote that is made from the mutagen that is oozing through your blood. The government will then send Sachs Industry a blank check, and I'm gonna be rich. Like, stupid rich.
Welcome back. Now, the New York Times reports that federal officials are planning to sharply increase the production of ZMapp. Now, of course, that's the vaccine developed for Ebola by a very small pharmaceutical company. in conjunction with the U.S. military and big pharma. It looks like they're going to get a lot more pharmaceutical companies involved on the profit making of this. They say that they're going to work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Wellcome Trust. They're also arranging for production of ZMapp in animal cells. Right now, it's being produced in plant cells. They say, although that would take longer, it would allow for greater output by tapping into the biotechnology industry's huge production capacity. We're going with multiple manufacturers. Now, take a step back and remember that the ZMapp virus is something that is first developed by exposing mice to Ebola. Once they create some antibodies, they genetically modify those antibodies, then grow them in tobacco plants that are genetically modified. That creates what they call plantibodies that they then inject into the patients. So they directly put in quote unquote antibodies or plantibodies that are going to immediately confront the virus as opposed to waiting for the body to build up its own immune system. Now, is this effective? It may sound creepy, it may sound scary, and I have severe concerns about the safety of this, but let's look at the efficacy of this. Now, when we first heard about ZMapp, it was headlines like this in the mainstream media. Experimental drug likely saved Ebola patients. Now, those patients were the two Americans who were brought back to Emory University, Dr. Kent Brantley and another aid worker who was working with Samaritan's Purse. We were told, and this is the narrative that we see in the CNN story, on Thursday, Dr. Kent Brantley thought he was going to die. It was 9th day since the American missionary worker came down sick with Ebola in Liberia. Then they talk about the miraculous recovery that he went through when he was given the ZMapp vaccine. But there was also another thing that they gave him that some other outlets reported. Newsweek reported that on the same day, he got a blood transfusion. The headline there was the 20-year-old Ebola treatment that could save Kent Brantley. That actually preceded by a couple of days all the mainstream media accounts attributing the recovery to ZMapp. And what they have here is a quote from Franklin Graham, president of Samaritan's Purse. He said, on Thursday, Brantley was given a shot at survival. A 14-year-old male Ebola patient who had been under Brantley's care and survived donated a unit of blood to Brantley, according to Samaritan's Purse. The young boy and his family wanted to be able to help the doctor that had saved his life. Well, that's very interesting because even though they recovered, they got the blood transfusion as well as ZMapp, we had two other patients who were given ZMapp that died. I don't know if they were given any other treatment. I don't know if they were given a blood transfusion. We still have 3 who were given the ZMapp vaccine, and it is unclear what their condition is at the moment. So if you just look at those numbers, and there were only 7 treatments that were sent out before they ran out of supply of the ZMapp vaccine, it doesn't look like it's any better than what people are experiencing in terms of recovery rates without that vaccine. Since Dr. Brantley recovered, another American doctor, Dr. Richard Sacra, also came down with Ebola. He was given blood transfusion from Dr. Kent Brantley, who sent blood to him. They were both of the same type. And of course, for the blood transfusion to work, if you're going to have a transfusion that's going to grant you immunity, you need to have the same type of blood for a transfusion. But also, there are several different types of strains of Ebola. There's at least 5 strains of Ebola. It's not clear that if you have recovered from one strain of Ebola, that it's going to give you immunity to the other strains. Nevertheless, this doctor was given a blood transfusion. So it raises the question, does Dr. Kent Brantley think that he was cured by ZMapp? Or does he think that he was cured by the blood transfusion? Well, actually, he says that he was cured by God. That's where he stands on this. But we have to look at this and question whether or not ZMapp has been proven to be effective. But that's not stopping the medical industrial complex from gearing up to make a lot of money off of this vaccine, perhaps making it mandatory. That's my concern. That's many people's concern. Now, Dr. Sacra is being treated in Nebraska, the Nebraska Medical Center. They're also giving him another experimental drug. They're not saying what it is. They say it is not ZMapp. And this is what the doctor there had to say. He said, we don't know if this is having an effect at all. We just administered everything that we had access to, honestly, and he's not going to name the drug because he doesn't want to mislead the public into thinking it's a cure. That's something we don't see happening from the other side.